My name is David Goldberg. I teach political science at the College of DuPage, and I'd like to talk about the recent events in Russia and Ukraine. So the question of why is Russia doing this? What's happening? I think is a good question that a lot of people are interested in. And so I think there's a couple different ways to look at this. I think when we look at what Russian President Putin has been talking about and is doing, from his perspective, I think there's sort of two issues. He's been talking about the expansion of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is right up against Russia's borders. And Russia has been invaded multiple times in the past centuries by people like Adolf Hitler and Napoleon. So historically, during the Soviet Union, the Soviets had a bunch of countries that were a buffer zone that prevented the idea of a land invasion of Russian territory. That's not a new argument. Since 1997, a number of the countries that were allied with the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, that were part of another security pact called the Warsaw Pact, have subsequently joined NATO. So from Putin's perspective, this is a security threat, that the creeping expansion of NATO in his backyard, as it were. More recently than that, he's talked about how Ukraine is not really a sovereign, independent state, and he has made it clear that he would like to restore what he views as historical Russian borders. This is not new. This occurred earlier in Crimea 7 years ago and in other places in the region, the Russian military expansion into sovereign states that he views as a part of Russia and the Soviet Union. I think that those are his two explanations. Most recently, in the last 48 hours, he's talked about Ukrainian aggression. Ukraine is it's sort of divided into two. It's a very large country geographically and divided really into two different sections. The section in the West identifies more with the European Union and Europe in generally, and is closer to those other NATO countries. The Eastern region has many more people, including the president, whose first language is Russian and who are more identifying with a Slavic identity and are more likely to identify with Russia. There's two breakaway republics that have been in the news. That's not entirely new. Those are regions that identify and are viewed as a part of Russia by Russia. So part of what Putin is trying to do is prevent what I think is Western Ukraine from becoming closer to Europe, the EU, and NATO, while also holding closer that eastern section, which is a natural ally. There's been a sort of low intensity conflict, insurgency conflict that's been supported by Russia for a long time, using social media, using cyber war tactics, as well as an actual insurgency conflict. So those are the explanations that he's given, as well as now he's talking about two words that are very important domestically in Russian politics and in European politics. He's talked about denazifying Ukraine and genocide in Ukraine. Those are code words. That's definitely a dog whistle. Russia lost 20 million people during World War II. Russia made tremendous sacrifices to defeat fascism. And so when a Russian president talks about denazification and genocide, that's going to get people's attention. Unfortunately, that is entirely inaccurate. There are no Nazis in power. There are no fascists in power. There are some far-right elements that have been active in the past years, but they are not in power and they are not allied to the president, who's half Jewish. So that is a particular insult to people that lived in Ukraine and remember the price that was paid under a German occupation during World War II. So his ability and the Russian foreign minister, their ability to say things that are inaccurate and sort of dog whistle Russians and people that are sympathetic is sort of breathtaking in its dishonesty. And I think that that's also consistent with the way the Soviet Union used to work, to just say things that were factually inaccurate about dissidents, about opposition. So this is not new, especially from Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB operative during the Cold War, the Soviet Secret Service. So that's a playbook that he pulls from because he lived through that, as did many people in positions of power diplomatically and militarily around the world, view things through a lens of the Cold War, and that's difficult for them to pull away from. So a lot of what Putin is doing is new at times, but also not new in terms of how he's behaving. So I think that's sort of how he views it from the perspective of Ukraine and what seems to be the rest of the world. There has been no provocative action. There's been no provocation. There's been no actions to justify the invasion of a sovereign state by a much more powerful country that is militarily in no position really to offer a serious offensive, right? They will fight back, and they're a proud people, and they have been supported and will continue to be supported militarily. But given the size and scope of Russia's military and the fact that Putin has been massing troops here and the size of the Russian military, there's no reason to believe that this is going to be a fair fight. So this is clearly a bully, a state that is a authoritarian state. I think the other piece of this that I would speak to that's important is that what Putin has been doing for years is to undermine Western institutions like the United Nations and NATO and the European Union. Those are institutions that support things like democracy, self-determination, human rights, the rule of law, rights for LGBTQ and other minority groups, identity minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. And he has made it crystal clear that he's opposed to all of those values, be it free elections, be it a government that's accountable to its citizens through elections and other mechanisms. So these things are a threat to him because he's been in power for 20 years and has shut down the press, the opposition press in Russia, and any pretense of a political alternative. So there's a couple big pieces there. I think part of it is domestic. I think part of it is historical. And part of it is Putin's agenda to weaken Western institutions while Europe is in the midst of a rise of populism and nationalism, that he's very happy to chime in places like Hungary and many others in Europe who are either flirting or directly embracing these notions about populism and nationalism, which I believe are in conflict and certainly in tension with those same values of democracy and human rights, self-determination, and rights for groups. So the second question was, why should Americans care about this? And I think that that's a really good question, especially after 22 years of warfare with the United States involved in conflicts in the Middle East that have cost the lives of thousands of American service members, and have cost, $1 trillion and will continue to cost, as well as the lives of what are probably millions of people that live in those countries. So that's a good question. Why should the United States care? Well, I think in general, the United States should care because part of our brand, part of our identity are those values that I mentioned about promotion of human rights, self-determination, and democracy. And when those things are under threat, the United States should pay attention. I think it's also a question of when a big authoritarian state with a powerful military like Russia is basically picking on, invading, and occupying potentially another country with no reason and no provocation, that's a violation of a lot of things that the United States has stood for since World War II. So this should be an anathema to the values that the United States holds dear and hopefully promotes among other countries. I think that's a key piece of it. I think this should not be, and for many people in terms of the debate in Congress, this is not a partisan issue. The issue is that essentially Russia is posing an attack and a threat to its neighbors and is going to be probably expanding that. There's the potential that this, I think another reason why Americans should care is it depends what happens and how Putin responds. What is going to be the response? What is the response from the international community? The EU is looking at tougher sanctions against Putin personally today, much more targeted sanctions than in the past. So what is the response going to be? And is that something that he can live with politically, economically, most importantly? Because if it's something that he can live with, and this is already sort of baked into his calculus, then that's a problem because he may then feel emboldened to take action in other places. And in a larger sense, the People's Republic of China is closely watching this because there are those that would argue that China's aggressive tone towards Taiwan is something that could be involved in this as well. That they might see an opportunity to retake Taiwan. In fairness, Chinese language about an aggressive tone towards Taiwan is used for domestic consumption, for domestic political reasons in China. That's not new at all. There does seem to be an increase in the scope of the language that's being used. So this is not just limited to Russia and Ukraine. That should be enough for people in the United States and other parts of the world to pay attention to and to be very, very concerned about what's taking place. But then when you look at other authoritarian powers like China, who unequivocally, like Vladimir Putin, are threatened by those values that I keep mentioning of human rights, democracy, self-determination, minority rights, as we see with Chinese crackdown on over 1 million ethnic Muslims of the Uyghur population that are being imprisoned. There's a pattern of behavior here where authoritarian states, especially large, powerful authoritarian states around the world, feel emboldened, and they're flexing their muscles, and that's part of what Putin is doing. So I think it's very, very, very important that Americans pay close attention to this, and that we think carefully about the world that we want to live in, and the response and what this might look like, as well as supporting a weaker country like Ukraine, supporting a country that we have an obligation to support. And there's different ways to provide that support in terms of intelligence, which has already been happening, and diplomacy, economically and militarily, and then also targeted sanctions. So there are a variety of tools that we're seeing sort of unfolded by the Biden administration and allies in Europe, who are taking a stronger tone in terms of that. It will be interesting to see how Russia responds to that and what that looks like. I think that's on a day-to-day basis as his language escalates to include nuclear weapons in the last 24 hours, that he's escalating his rhetoric. The next couple of days, I think, will be particularly important. And of course, the next couple of weeks. Does he go all the way to Kyiv? Does he pretend to occupy the country? What are the costs? As we watch TV, and you can see this on any network, see this literally unfold, as an overmatched army, military, and then civilians are increasingly the toll of this. It will be interesting to see the response both in Russia, where I did see some images about protests in Moscow against the war, as well as the rest of the world. I think it'll be very important to see what the response is and how that response is internalized in Moscow.